A lone Corsair drops through the Philippine sky, its teenage pilot white-knuckled on the stick. He has no altitude to trade, no room to maneuver, no wingman. The manual says climb and fight from above. He does the opposite. He shoves the nose down and races toward the ocean surface, flying inches above the water the way he used to skim his father's wheat fields back in Nebraska. The Zeros follow aggressively. 20 seconds later, one is in the water. The other breaks off, blinded. Philippine Sea, August 1945. The air over the Pacific doesn't care about training manuals. It smells of engine oil and salt water, and it turns boys into statistics. The cockpit of an F-4U Corsair at 8,000 feet is tight, deafening, and shaking from the roar of a 2,000 horsepower radial engine. The instrument dials glow dim green. The control stick vibrates under sweaty hands. Below, the ocean spreads out like hammered steel, swallowing wreckage and offering nothing back. This is the final months of the Pacific War. American carrier squadrons operate deep in Japanese-controlled waters, flying patrols that stretch fuel tanks to their limits. The stakes are calculated and unforgiving. Every mission burns fuel, wears down machines, and risks lives. Replacement pilots arrive by the dozen, young, undertrained, barely out of flight school. Some make it through 10 missions. Some don't make it through one. The math is brutal. Japanese pilots still outnumber American fighters 2-to-1 in contested airspace. The Zero is lighter, more agile, and flown by veterans who've survived years of combat. American doctrine is crystal clear. Maintain altitude, use your speed advantage in a dive, hit hard and get out. Never, under any circumstances, get into a turning fight with a Zero. The rules are written in the blood of dead pilots. They've been refined over 3 years of island-hopping hell. They work when you follow them. Survival rates go up. Breaking the rules means a watery grave and a telegram to your parents. But doctrine assumes you have choices. It assumes you're not alone, not already bleeding altitude, not cut off from your squadron with 2 enemy fighters boxing you in. It assumes you have time to think. Nathan Shelton had none of those things. Nathan Shelton turned 18 3 weeks before he climbed into a Corsair for the first time. He'd graduated flight school in June 1945, part of an accelerated program that turned farm boys into fighter pilots in 8 months instead of the peacetime standard of 2 years. The instructors in Pensacola called his class the Express Train, rushed through ground school, pushed through aerobatics, shoved into combat training before the muscle memory had time to settle. When the war started, the Navy could afford to be selective. By 1945, they needed warm bodies in cockpits. Shelton's file was thin. Born in Grand Island, Nebraska. Father owned a grain elevator. Volunteered the day after his 17th birthday, lied about his age, got caught, then re-enlisted the moment he was legal. He'd flown crop dusters in the summers, low and fast over wheat fields, dodging power lines and tree lines. That experience bought him exactly nothing in the Navy's eyes except a checkmark next to prior flight hours. The Corsair didn't care that he knew how to read a field from 50 feet up. It was 14,000 pounds of engine and armor that wanted to kill him if he hesitated. His squadron commander took one look at Shelton's logbook and shook his head. 60 hours in trainers. 20 hours in the Corsair, most of it landing practice on a dirt strip in California. No gunnery qualification above adequate. No navigation experience beyond following a coastline. The ink on his certification papers was still wet when he reported to the escort carrier USS Tulagi in Manila Bay. The flight deck crew called him the Kid. The other pilots called him nothing at all, because learning names was a waste of time. Shelton understood the math. Replacement pilots had a 20% chance of dying on their first 5 missions. The odds improved if you survived the initial learning curve, but most didn't. The veterans had a look in their eyes, not cruelty, just indifference. They'd seen too many fresh faces disappear into the Pacific. They'd stopped counting. Shelton wanted to prove he was different, that the age on his file didn't matter, that he belonged in the formation. He studied the manual until the pages wore soft. He memorized every emergency procedure, every combat drill, every altitude and airspeed combination for every scenario. He thought preparation would save him. On his third patrol, flying loose escort over a supply convoy, he learned the difference between a manual and a war. The Zeros came out of the sun at 10,000 feet, dropping on the formation like hawks on sparrows. Shelton's flight leader took cannon fire in the first pass and tumbled toward the water trailing black smoke. The wingman broke left and vanished into a cloud bank. And Nathan Shelton, 18 years old with ink-fresh wings and a head full of doctrine, found himself alone with 2 enemy fighters diving on his tail and nowhere left to run but down. The mission briefing had been routine. 3 Corsairs escorting a pair of PBY Catalinas on a search-and-rescue sweep southeast of Luzon. Simple job. Stay high, keep your eyes open, bring everyone home. The veteran pilots barely listened. They'd flown this route 40 times. Shelton took notes. They climbed out at dawn, the Corsairs throttled back to match the lumbering seaplanes below. The formation cruised at 10,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold. Shelton flew the number 3 position, tucked in behind Lieutenant Cole's wing. His job was simple: watch Cole's 6 o'clock and don't do anything stupid. He kept checking his mirrors, scanning the empty sky, gripping the stick too tightly. The sun climbed behind them, turning the Pacific into hammered bronze. Shelton's radio crackled with idle chatter. Cole is complaining about the powdered eggs at breakfast. The other wingman is humming something off-key. The normalcy felt wrong. Shelton kept waiting for something to happen, kept expecting the radio to explode with warnings. But the sky stayed empty. That was the trap. The Zeros came from directly above, hidden in the sun's glare where American pilots were trained never to look without tinted goggles. Shelton caught the flash of wings half a second before the first burst of 20mm cannon fire stitched across Cole's fuselage. The lieutenant's Corsair shuddered, coughed black smoke, and nosed over into a steep dive. No radio call. No ejection. Just gone. Shelton's brain froze. The manual said to brake hard and dive for speed. His hands refused to move. He watched Cole's plane tumble, watched it get smaller, watched the Pacific reach up and swallow it without a splash visible from this altitude. The second Zero opened fire on the remaining wingman. Tracers arced past Shelton's canopy, glowing white-hot in the morning sun. His wingman broke left and disappeared into a wall of cumulus clouds, trailing fuel vapor. Smart. Shelton should have followed. But his body wouldn't respond. 3 seconds of paralysis that felt like an hour. Then his Corsair shook. Metal screamed. The instrument panel cracked. He looked up through the canopy and saw them, 2 Zeros, pulling out of their attack dive, looping back around for another pass. They moved like dancers, graceful and precise, their lighter frames carving tight arcs through the air. Shelton's Corsair felt like a brick in comparison. His radio was dead. His flight leader was dead. He was alone at 10,000 feet with 2 enemy fighters who just dismantled his formation in under 10 seconds. The manual had a procedure for this. Step 1. Climb and run. Use your engine's superior speed in level flight. Extend the distance. Escape. Shelton looked at his airspeed indicator. 210 knots. The Zeros were already turning inside him, already positioning for another gun run. He wasn't going to outrun them. He wasn't going to outclimb them. He had one option left. He pushed the stick forward and dove. The Corsair's nose dropped like a guillotine blade. Shelton's stomach climbed into his throat as 10,000 feet of empty air opened up beneath him. The altimeter unwound in a blur. 9,000. 8,000. The engine screamed, the propeller clawing at thinner air, pulling him down faster than gravity alone could manage. His airspeed indicator climbed past 250 knots, then 300, the needle shaking against its stop. Behind him, the Zeros followed. He could see them in his rearview mirror, two dark shapes tucked into tight formation, matching his dive angle degree for degree. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. They had him boxed. If he pulled up, they'd be on him before he could level out. If he kept diving, he'd run out of sky. The ocean was rushing up to meet him, that endless bronze sheet resolving into individual swells and whitecaps. 7,000 feet. The Corsair shuddered, the airframe groaning under the stress. Shelton's hands ached from gripping the stick. Every instinct screamed at him to pull up, to level off, to give himself room to maneuver. But the moment he did, he was dead. The Zeros were faster in level flight. They'd shred him before he could blink. 6,000 feet. A stream of tracers arced past his left wing, glowing white-hot. They were firing at range, testing his nerves. One of the Zeros pulled slightly ahead, trying to cut off his escape angle. The other stayed high, covering. They were hurting him, pushing him down into the killing zone where there'd be no room to evade. 5,000 feet. Shelton's vision tunneled. The ocean filled his windscreen, vast and indifferent. He could see the texture of the water now, the wind patterns etched across the surface. His father's voice echoed in his head from those summer mornings over the wheat fields. "Low and fast, boy. That's where you learn what the machine can really do." 4,000 feet. The air grew thicker, humid, heavy with salt. The Corsair's engine note changed, deeper, more labored. Shelton's flight suit stuck to his back with sweat. His hands trembled on the controls. This was insane. He was diving away from safety, throwing away every advantage the Corsair had, violating every rule in the manual. 3,000 feet. Another burst of cannon fire, closer this time. Holes punched through his left aileron. The plane yawed hard right. Shelton fought the stick, corrected, kept the nose down. The Zeros were getting impatient. They wanted this over. 2,000 feet. 1,000. The water was so close now he could see individual waves, see the foam trailing off their crests. His altimeter was nearly useless at this range. He was navigating by instinct, by the same gut sense that kept him from hitting fence posts when he was dusting crops at dawn. 500 feet. The Zeros were still behind him, still closing. But something had changed. The lead Zero was pulling up slightly, giving himself room. The ocean was no longer just a backdrop. It was a wall, rising up to meet them all. Shelton pushed the stick forward one more time. 300 feet. 200. 100. The Corsair's belly was so close to the water he could feel the air change, feel it grow solid beneath him, pushing back against the wings. And then something impossible happened. The plane stopped sinking. Shelton's first thought was that he'd stalled. The Corsair hung suspended at 50 feet above the Pacific, engine still roaring, propeller still spinning, but the descent had simply stopped. The stick felt different in his hands, stiffer, more responsive, like the control surfaces were biting into something solid instead of thin air. He wasn't climbing. He wasn't falling. He was floating. The sensation was familiar in a way that made no sense. It felt like those mornings over the wheat fields, skimming the stalks at dawn when the air was cool and heavy with dew. The crop duster would settle into a groove just above the plants, riding on a cushion of compressed air that made the plane feel almost magnetic to the ground. His instructor had warned him never to fly that low. It was dangerous, unpredictable, a good way to clip a fence post and cartwheel into a barn. But it had always felt safer to Shelton. More stable. Like the air itself was holding him up. He risked a glance at his instruments. Airspeed holding at 280 knots. The altitude needle was bouncing between 40 and 60 feet, too low for accurate reading. Engine temperature is climbing, but not critical. Everything should have felt wrong. He should have been fighting for control, wrestling with turbulence, waiting for a swell to reach up and swat him out of the sky. Instead, the Corsair felt planted. Solid. The stick required less input to maintain level flight. The wings weren't hunting for lift, they had it, more than they should have had at this altitude. It was as if the ocean itself was pushing back against the plane's weight, refusing to let it fall those final 50 feet. Ground effect. The words surfaced from some half-forgotten lecture at flight school. When an aircraft flies close to a surface, the air compressed between the wings and the ground creates additional lift. Reduces drag. Makes the plane more efficient. The instructor had mentioned it as a technical curiosity, something that happened during landing, not a combat tactic. You were supposed to avoid it. Flying that low was insane. Shelton's hands moved before his brain caught up. He eased the throttle back slightly, testing. The Corsair maintained altitude. He nudged the stick left. The plane responded crisply, no sluggishness, no lag. At this speed, this low, he should have been wallowing like a boat in heavy seas. Instead, he had control. Real control. Behind him, the Zeros were still there. He could hear their engines, a higher-pitched scream compared to the Corsair's deep roar. But they weren't firing. He checked his mirror. Both enemy fighters had pulled up to 200 feet, maybe 300. They were circling, wary, trying to figure out what he was doing. They'd never seen this before. Neither had Shelton. The ocean streaked past below him, gray-green swells blurring into a continuous surface. His prop wash carved a visible trench in the water, throwing up salt spray that misted his canopy. The noise was deafening, engine, wind, the roar of disturbed water. But underneath it all, Shelton felt something he hadn't felt since the ambush started. He felt safe. 50 feet above the Pacific, boxed in by enemy fighters, violating every rule of aerial combat, Nathan Shelton finally understood what his plane could do. And he was done running. The first Zero came in low, committed to the attack. Shelton saw him in the mirror, dropping from 300 feet to match altitude, nose pointed straight at the Corsair's tail. The Japanese pilot was good. He'd closed the distance to 400 yards before Shelton even registered the threat. At this range, with nowhere to maneuver, it should have been over. Shelton dropped another 10 feet. The Corsair's massive 13-foot propeller bit deeper into the ocean surface. What had been a mist of spray became a wall. Salt water exploded upward in sheets, a rooster tail 20 feet high that hung in the air like fog. The prop wash didn't just disturb the water, it atomized it, creating an instant whiteout that stretched 50 yards behind the plane. The Zero's guns opened up. Shelton heard the cannon fire, saw tracers arc toward him, then watched them vanish into the spray. The rounds were going wide, high, scattered. The Japanese pilot was firing blind, guessing where the Corsair should be based on where it had been 3 seconds ago. But Shelton had dropped lower, and the curtain of salt water masked everything: his position, his altitude, even his engine exhaust. The Zero overshot, screaming past Shelton's left wing at 200 yards, pulling up hard to avoid the spray. Shelton caught a glimpse of the pilot's face through the canopy, young, frustrated, squinting against the whiteout. The enemy fighter climbed back to altitude, circling, trying to reacquire his target. Shelton stayed low. The propeller kept churning the ocean into chaos. He couldn't see behind him anymore. The spray had coated his mirrors, turned his rear visibility into a blur of white and gray. But that meant they couldn't see him either. He was flying inside his own smoke screen, a natural defensive curtain made of nothing but physics and seawater. The second Zero tried a different approach. He came in from the side, angling for a deflection shot that would avoid the spray. Smarter. More patient. Shelton waited until the enemy fighter committed, then jerked the stick hard right. The Corsair carved through the air, stable and responsive, the ground effect keeping him planted even through the violent turn. His prop wash followed him like a ghost, the wall of spray shifting with his movement, always between him and the shooters. More cannon fire. More misses. The Zeros were hunting a target they could barely see, trying to lead a plane whose position kept shifting inside a cloud of salt spray. It was like shooting at shadows. Every time they thought they had a solution, Shelton would drop another 5 feet or bank another 10 degrees, and the spray would swallow him again. His engine temperature gauge crept into the red. The Corsair wasn't designed for this kind of sustained low-altitude flying. The salt was coating everything: the windscreen, the engine cowling, probably the control surfaces. But the plane kept flying, kept throwing up that protective wall, kept him alive. One of the Zeros broke off, climbing back to altitude. Frustrated. Low on ammunition, maybe, or unwilling to risk another pass through the spray. The other stayed committed, circling at 200 feet, looking for an opening that didn't exist. Shelton grinned behind his fogged goggles. They'd come down here to kill him. Now they were stuck trying to fight a ghost in a salt storm, and the ocean was his ally. The remaining Zero made his decision. Instead of circling above, frustrated and impotent, he dropped his nose and committed. Shelton watched him come down through the spray, descending from 200 feet to 100, then to 75. The Japanese pilot was skilled. His approach was steady, controlled, nose tracking the Corsair's path through the whiteout. He was going to match Shelton's altitude and end this with a point-blank gun solution. 50 feet. The Zero leveled off, throttle wide open, closing the gap. Shelton could see the details now: the mottled green camouflage, the red Hinomaru rising sun on the fuselage, the dark shape of the pilot hunched over his controls. 400 yards. 350. The enemy fighter was fast, nimble, perfectly suited for the high-altitude knife fights where Japanese pilots had dominated for years. But down here, the rules were different. The Zero hit the turbulent air at 40 feet and started to wobble. The plane's lightweight frame, built for maneuverability and climb rate, became a liability in the thick, churning atmosphere just above the ocean. Every swell kicked up eddies and vortices. Every gust of wind off a whitecap slapped the wings. The Zero's control surfaces hunted for stability, overcorrecting, then overcorrecting again. The pilot fought the stick, trying to maintain formation, but the plane was dancing beneath him. Shelton's Corsair, 14,000 pounds of American steel and armor, plowed through the same turbulence like it wasn't there. The weight that made it sluggish at altitude became an anchor at sea level. The massive engine pulled steady power. The wings, built to handle carrier landings and diving attacks, absorbed the punishment without complaint. Shelton barely had to adjust his grip on the stick. 300 yards. The Zero dropped another 5 feet, trying to get below the worst of Shelton's spray. Wrong move. At 35 feet, a swell rose up beneath the Japanese fighter, not high enough to hit, but close enough that the updraft caught the Zero's wing. The plane lurched sideways, wallowing. The pilot corrected hard, jerked the nose back on target, but his airspeed was bleeding off. He was fighting his own aircraft now, not just Shelton. 250 yards. Shelton eased his throttle forward slightly, just enough to maintain the gap. He wasn't trying to outrun the Zero anymore. He was making the enemy pilot work for every inch of closure, burning fuel and patience while the ocean tried to kill him. The Zero's engine note changed, higher pitched, strained. The pilot was pushing too hard, demanding performance the airframe couldn't give in this environment. Shelton saw the nose dip fractionally, watched the plane sink another 3 feet. Too low. Way too low. A swell rose beneath the Zero's belly. Not a big one, maybe 6 feet crest to trough, the kind of wave Shelton had been threading for the past 5 minutes without thinking. The Japanese fighter had no margin for error. The swell caught the Zero's landing gear doors, just a glancing contact, barely a touch. But at 290 knots, Barely a touch was enough. The Zero flipped nose down and cartwheeled into the Pacific. No fireball. No explosion. Just a massive gout of white water and then nothing. The ocean swallowed the wreckage in less than 3 seconds. Shelton's hands were shaking. One down. The last Zero broke off immediately. Shelton watched him climb hard, pulling away from the ocean surface like it was on fire. Smart. The Japanese pilot had just watched his wingman die in a spray of white water, and he wasn't interested in testing whether the same thing would happen to him. He leveled off at 1,000 feet, circling, reassessing. Shelton kept flying his pattern, low and fast, the propeller still churning salt spray into a defensive wall. His engine temperature was deep in the red now. The Corsair was coughing intermittently, cylinders misfiring from salt contamination. He had maybe 10 minutes before something critical failed. But 10 minutes was enough. The Zero couldn't touch him down here, and if the pilot tried to disengage completely, Shelton could start climbing and run for home. Stalemate. Almost. The Zero dove again. Not a cautious approach this time, but a full commitment. Nose vertical, engine screaming, diving from 1,000 feet straight down at the Corsair's tail. Desperation or anger, Shelton couldn't tell which. The Japanese pilot wasn't trying to match altitude anymore. He was going for a single high-speed gun pass, planning to fire on the way down and pull out before he hit the turbulence zone. Shelton saw it coming. The Zero's angle was too steep, his airspeed building too fast. The pilot was trading control for speed, betting everything on one shot. 4 seconds to impact. 3. Shelton held his course, steady, letting the enemy commit. 2 seconds. Tracers erupted from the Zero's nose, a stream of 20mm cannon fire that chewed the water 50 yards behind Shelton's tail. The pilot was overcorrecting for deflection, firing too early, too eager. 1 second. The Zero pulled out of the dive at 200 feet, nose coming up hard, wings flexing under the G-load. The pilot had timed it perfectly. He'd clear the turbulent air with 50 feet to spare and be back at altitude before Shelton could react. Except he'd forgotten about the swells. The Pacific wasn't flat. It never was. The surface rose and fell in long rolling patterns, 5-foot swells marching east to west across the open ocean. Shelton had learned to read them, to anticipate where the water would be in the next 3 seconds. The Japanese pilot, focused on his pullout, had not. The Zero's left wing clipped the crest of a swell at 190 feet. Not a direct hit, just a graze. The wingtip brushed through the top 6 inches of white water. But at 350 knots, 6 inches was enough. The wing shattered. The Zero snap-rolled left, violent and uncontrolled, tumbling across the sky like a kicked football. Shelton didn't wait to see the impact. The moment the Zero rolled, he hauled back on the stick and kicked full right rudder. The Corsair snapped into a barrel roll, 90 degrees of bank in less than a second, pulling perpendicular to his previous course. The G-forces slammed him into his seat. His vision grayed at the edges. The ocean tilted sideways, then inverted, then snapped back to horizontal as he completed the roll and leveled out heading northwest. Behind him, the Zero hit the water inverted. The explosion was small, muted, swallowed by the vastness of the Pacific. 2 down. Shelton was alone. The sky was empty. His engine was dying. But he was alive, and the manual had been wrong about everything. The climb lasted 30 seconds before Shelton's engine started hammering. The number 3 cylinder had quit completely, choked with salt and corrosion. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The oil pressure gauge dropped into the yellow. He leveled off at 500 feet and the hammering eased, but the damage was done. The Corsair had given him everything it had at sea level. Now it was dying by degrees. Shelton checked his fuel gauge. Half empty. The combat had burned through his reserves faster than any textbook engagement. He plotted a rough heading northwest toward the carrier group, somewhere over the horizon, maybe 60 miles out. At this altitude, flying straight and level, he might make it. Might. Then his radio crackled to life. The static cleared for a moment, and he heard fragments of Japanese voice traffic, clipped, urgent, broadcasting on a frequency the Americans monitored. Another patrol had heard the fight. They were vectoring in, looking for the combatants, probably expecting to find their own pilots circling over wreckage. Instead, they'd find nothing but empty ocean and a lot of questions. Shelton pushed the nose down. The Corsair dropped back toward the water, engine protesting, oil temperature climbing. He leveled off at 50 feet. The same 50 feet that had saved his life 10 minutes ago. If the Japanese patrol was using radar to search, and they probably were, he'd just vanished from their scopes. Radar couldn't see through the ocean's surface clutter. Down here, he was invisible. A ghost skimming the waves. But staying this low meant burning more fuel. The thick air at sea level demanded more power to maintain speed. His engine was already compromised. Every minute at this altitude was a gamble that the Corsair would hold together long enough to reach the carrier. He checked the fuel gauge again. The needle had dropped perceptibly in the last 5 minutes. The ocean stretched out endlessly ahead. Gray-green swells marching toward the horizon. No landmarks. No reference points. Just water and sky and the constant roar of a dying engine. Shelton flew by compass and dead reckoning, trusting that the carrier group hadn't moved too far from its last known position. If they'd changed course, if they'd steamed south or east while he was fighting for his life, he'd run out of fuel somewhere over the Philippine Sea and no one would ever know what happened to him. His hands ached from gripping the stick. His eyes burned from squinting through salt-crusted goggles. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was draining away, leaving behind exhaustion and the shakes. He wanted to climb, to get altitude, to give himself options if the engine quit completely. But the radio kept crackling with Japanese voices, closer now, searching. 30 miles to the carrier. 20. Shelton's engine was misfiring on 2 cylinders now. The propeller was barely pulling. He coaxed the throttle forward, begging for a few more minutes of power. The Corsair responded with a lurch and a cough and kept flying. 10 miles. He could see the horizon changing, a dark smudge that might have been ships or might have been his imagination. The fuel gauge was touching empty. His oil pressure was gone. The engine would seize any second. 5 miles. The smudge resolved into shapes. Destroyers. The carrier. Home. Shelton keyed his dead radio anyway, hoping someone was listening. Ghost flight, coming in low. Don't shoot. The Corsair climbed for the last time. The landing was ugly. Shelton came in too fast, too steep, with an engine that quit on final approach. The Corsair dropped onto the carrier deck like a thrown brick, caught the number 3 wire, and jerked to a halt with a scream of stressed metal. Deck crew swarmed the plane before the propeller stopped spinning. They found Shelton still strapped in, hands locked on the stick, staring straight ahead at nothing. The squadron commander pulled him out of the cockpit personally. Shelton's legs wouldn't hold him. 2 sailors caught him before he hit the deck. Someone pressed a canteen into his hands. He drank without tasting it. His flight suit was soaked through with sweat and salt water. His face was crusted white where spray had dried on his goggles and skin. "Where's the rest of your flight?" the commander asked. Shelton's voice came out hoarse. "Gone. Cole went down in the first pass. Jensen broke into the clouds. I don't know if he made it. And the Zeros. 2 of them." Shelton looked up, meeting the commander's eyes. "I got both." The commander stared at him. An 18-year-old replacement pilot, on his 3rd mission, claiming 2 kills against veteran Japanese fighters. It should have sounded like fantasy or shock or a rookie's desperate need to justify survival. Except the Corsair was sitting on the deck behind them, salt-caked and smoking, with cannon holes stitched across the tail and both Zeros conspicuously absent from the sky. How? I went down to the water. They followed. I stayed there. They didn't. It took 3 hours to develop the gun camera film. The squadron gathered in the ready room to watch, skeptical and curious in equal measure. The projector clicked to life. Grainy black and white footage filled the screen. The images were chaotic at first: sky, water, a blur of motion. Then the perspective steadied and the room went silent. They watched Shelton's Corsair drop to 50 feet above the Pacific. They watched the massive wall of spray explode behind the propeller. They watched a Zero attempt to follow and start wallowing in the turbulent air. They watched the enemy fighter clip a swell and cartwheel into the ocean. They watched the second Zero dive from altitude, pull out too low, and disintegrate against the water. The footage ran for 6 minutes. No one spoke. When it ended, the commander rewound it and played it again. Then again. He took notes the third time through, writing down altitudes and speeds and angles of attack. Other pilots crowded around, pointing at the screen, arguing about what they were seeing. By sunset, the footage was on its way to Pearl Harbor. By the end of the week, it reached the training command in San Diego. By September, every fighter pilot in the Pacific Fleet had seen Nathan Shelton's gun camera tape. The tactic had a name now: wave hopping. The manual included a new section on low-altitude defensive maneuvers, complete with diagrams and recommended procedures. Shelton got a Navy Cross and a promotion. He flew 62 more missions before the war ended. He survived them all. But he never forgot those 10 minutes over the Philippine Sea when an 18-year-old rookie broke every rule in the book and discovered that sometimes the manual is wrong. Sometimes you have to write your own.